Hey y'all, welcome back to Poli-Side-Eye. I am Chris, C-Diggy1, who is in obvious need of a haircut right now. This is my co-host Jared, JC Tiger fan. Now, what does it feel like to have normalcy in the White House? Like a regular press briefing with little to no lies. You
Oh
know?
yeah. I mean, it's bad whenever the bar is that low. So all you need is for someone not to lie for that to be like worthy of celebration. But I mean, that's where we are. And at least there's some kind of transparency, if you will, that just didn't exist before. In fact, I think the 45 administration didn't even have press conferences after a certain point. So the fact that they're even having them on a daily basis is
Right. Usually with the president, like the former one, I would be like, okay, what is he going to do this week? Or I have to worry about him, like, is he going to like destroy the country finally? So it's kind of like a breath of fresh air, but 2021 will continue to 2021 with this whole stock market thing.
Yeah, this I haven't really been following too closely. I don't dabble in the stock market. It's essentially gambling, and I'm not a gambler, and I don't have money like that. So I just leave that to the other people in the world to.
Well, I'm a gambler, and I didn't know that much about the stock market, but I did have like my hands in a few stocks with Robinhood. And then my friend, I won't say his name, you know him, he was telling me that morning, yesterday, like, you need to invest in some AMC stock because GameStop just blew up. And I was like, wow, like from $20 to 300 and some dollars a share. So then, yeah, I got in on a little AMC thing, and then I see the news yesterday. Wall Street is in a tizzy, the rich. To your point, aren't you like happy for the little guy though? That's like, taking advantage of the system?
Uh, I'm ambivalent. So
Here
on
you go. And I'm the one wearing a Daria shirt, but okay.
I'm ambivalent. On one hand, I think it's good that people are starting to recognize that this so-called free market is not free and it's manipulated. It always has been. And so on one hand, I'm like, yay, this might radicalize people. But as I tweeted, I was like, the takeaway shouldn't be we should make the system more inclusive. The whole notion of Wall Street is a farce. Like it is, like I said, it's a casino. And so I don't think the takeaway should be let's make it easier for people to be incorporated into this casino. The takeaway should be the casino shouldn't exist because it destroys people's lives. I mean, 2008, that whole recession was all about essentially people doing, obviously on a much larger scale, what's going on now.
Wall Street, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so the whole selling short and all of these really arcane things that people essentially engaged in ultimately was what caused the 2008 2009 downturn. And so I don't think this is something that people should be aspiring to take part in. It should be, but I recognize. So on one hand, I'm like, this is great because people are acknowledging that it is a rigged system, but the way that you beat a rigged system isn't by incorporating yourself into a rigged system. It's to dismantle said rigged system. And so that's what I have a little bit of a problem with. It's that people see that something is going on, but they're like, let me use this as the opportunity to get my slice of the pie. And so I don't know, I'm kind of mixed.
Right. If it's one thing, the pandemic has really highlighted just so many inequalities. I mean, I think that's the only thing I'm glad that the pandemic did. I see it as like, oh, okay, well, you have these rich people that have been banking on this so long, but when the little guy does it, oh, it's a problem. We need to put stuff in place. We need the White House to monitor it. So people want to say that it's like market manipulation is what the disenfranchised are doing, but isn't like what Robinhood doing now? Like now they're preventing people to even buy the stock, period. That's market manipulation. So I think it's all like contradictory.
I mean, it is contradictory, but I've written about this before, that capitalism is inherently a contradictory system. But the way that you combat a contradictory system isn't by engaging in furthering a contradictory system. You dismantle the system. And so I get, on one hand, I'm kind of like, I understand that people are like, well, if it's going to be rigged, let me at least try to secure my bag. But I don't think that that works, because I saw before we started talking that the Wall Street Journal reported that they're going to essentially start trying to criminalize people who are doing some of these things on Robinhood. And so the reason I err against people trying to essentially engage in the same thing that the rich people are doing is because they're not going to be held to account in the same way that you are. So they have the power and the resources and the tools to get themselves out of this mess. You don't. So don't try to use their tools to essentially beat, because you're not going to beat them at their own game. It's just not going to happen. So we being people who recognize that it's unfair, should be collectively thinking about and envisioning a new way to structure society that is more fair, and not trying to essentially join in this ridiculous system.
Fair. You have a point, sir. You have a point. But my segue is to today's topic. Speaking of dismantling systems, the prison system. Now, in our last episode, you said that if you had your way, you would abolish the prison system, like just get rid of all prisons, correct?
Yes, that is right.
And for the average Joe, like me, I'm just thinking, how are we going to punish criminals? Isn't the prison put in place? Like, I know like a lot of disenfranchised people are put there, the whole race issue, private prisons, who I think like President Biden just did something about that too.
Yeah, he signed an executive order banning I'm not sure all the nuances, but putting some stipulation or some restrictions, I should say, in the for-profit sector of the prison system. It's obviously very limited in scope because it's an executive order, so there's only but so much you can do with that. But yeah, I think it kind of broached the conversation about prisons that I think are timely for this conversation.
So I'm going to ask you, why do you think we don't need prisons? How can our society function without one? And then once you explain that, I'm going to have my follow-up question. So go ahead.
My first response is, you said, how would society function without prisons? My answer to that would be, society isn't functioning with them. So the notion that we need them right then and there should be pretty much, questionable in the first place. So one thing before I go further is I would recommend this book to everyone who's interested. It's called Are Prisons Obsolete? It's by Angela Davis. And it is essentially a text that is for anybody who is curious about this idea of living in a world without prisons. I would recommend that book. So when I say that I'm a prison abolitionist, what I mean by that is, so first off, we have to reimagine what we think prison is, and what the task of prison should be. So the way that prisons operate now is essentially they are a means of control. So people will say, well, we have to have prisons because what happens if somebody breaks in your house and shoots you? Then what do we have to do with them? And I'm like, well, people are breaking into people's homes and shooting them as it is with prisons. So it's not as though prisons are acting as a means to stop that type of behavior. It's not. And so if we're thinking about prisons as a means of protection, it's failing at that. It's not doing it. We have all of the violent crimes and all these things that people always say we need prisons for. We have prisons and we still have violent crime. So the notion that it is solving that problem is not true. Now, when you ask how will we punish people, I think the question should be then, well, is that what prisons should be doing? Is prison simply a means of punishing people, or is it a way to actually kind of rehabilitate our society and people who engage in these types of behavior?
Before you say your point, I just want to make sure, I think prisons should punish as well as rehabilitate. So why can't they do both? You can still punish someone for breaking the law and at the same time be able to rehabilitate them, or at least try.
If I'm getting your question right, you're pointing out two things. So you think the function of prison should be to punish a wrongdoer and to essentially rehabilitate them so they don't necessarily commit the same act again in the future.
Correct. Although I will say some crimes are just like, I want them to throw away the key. That's just how I feel. Like murder, with clear intent.
Okay, so then you say for someone who commits a heinous murder, they should be locked up and we should throw away the key. Now, by locking them up, do you think that they should suffer through that in their imprisonment?
Yes.
Okay, so the question I would have is, then why do you think that they should be suffering?
Because the families of said person that they murdered are suffering. You took a life. You can't change that, you know? So that's why.
Okay, so then this is for everyone watching. This is not, there's no right or wrong answer. This is all imagining, but this is what we should do. So my question then would be, well, how is that justice? So people have theorized about what is justice. Like if in this example you gave, by locking this person up and kind of subjecting them to these conditions, it's not necessarily restoring anything. So if someone is murdered, it's not as though locking them up and throwing away the key and making them sleep on cement can bring back the dead person, unfortunately. So would that necessarily qualify as justice? I think that's debatable. So really what we want, what that is we really just want vindication. That's an entirely different question. If you want, or vengeance, I should say. And that's an entirely different question. And so there is another famous prison abolitionist. Her name is Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And she also is anti-prison. She's also anti-police. And one thing that she said one time that really resonated with me is that we have to figure out a way to live in a world where inflicting harm on somebody else doesn't necessarily give us some form of satisfaction. So what she meant by that, and so she was kind of speaking about the way that she became a prison abolitionist. So she actually had a really close cousin that that was shot down in cold blood. And she argued that that experience, while to most people, it probably would have made them a bigger proponent of prisons, it actually made her more of a prison abolitionist. And the reason that it did is because she essentially was saying that she doesn't want anybody to have to suffer the way that she did. So thinking about like the murderer's family, what if the person who committed that crime has family who would then no longer be able to see them because of the act that they committed? So when we think about suffering, it's not just the immediate parties that are affected. So you mentioned that, oh, well, think about the families and how they might react. Well, there's also, think about the families of the person who knows the person that goes to the jail because of the act. How might they react? Do they have a stake in the conversation? So I think whenever, again, this is a debate. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. It's just about when we think about the way that we want to envision society. It's just the question is, do you want to operate in a society where kind of an eye for an eye is kind of the way that we operate? I personally don't want to live in that type of society for a number of reasons. But again, there's no right or wrong answer. I just don't necessarily think if we're trying to create a society where these things won't happen, I don't think prisons are a way that we go about doing that. There's plenty of research that shows that laws are usually adjusted or have changed over time. What constitutes a crime has changed over time. Oftentimes it is a way to criminalize Black people and other people of color. So more times than not, we being Black people are going to suffer disproportionately by these systems. So I think that's also something to keep in mind as well.
I think we've been, since we were young, been conditioned to know there's good and evil. If you do something bad, there needs to be some sort of, like, something needs to happen. I mean, like, from superhero movies, Disney films, even in the Bible, like heaven and hell. Like, you know, you do something terrible and wrong, you go to hell and you're going to suffer. Me using a Bible reference right now is just so
This is very
it really is. It's just the conditioning of it, you know? Like, I think there should be something done about it. It just can't be like, oh, people go willy-nilly in the streets without any type of law. So I'm guessing my question to you is, okay, like, what to do with those people then who do murder and do violent crimes, and what to do with them? Like, what should we do with them if prison isn't a thing?
Well, I think part of also being a prison abolitionist is understanding what drives people to engage in those types of behavior. So some people might just say, oh, well, people just are naturally inclined to murder someone. And I would argue that there's plenty of research that shows that people don't just come out of the womb ready to grab the nearest knife and like stick it to somebody. Like, there are obviously social conditions that create the desire to inflict that type of harm on another person. What prison abolitionists would argue is that if we're trying to essentially create a society where these types of things don't happen, then we need to understand the root causes of what they are. And so if someone commits a type of crime like that, and you said that you are open to rehabilitation, then we should try to understand then, okay, well, what was it that led them to want to engage in this type of behavior? So my short answer to that question would be, there is no one size fits all. Like, I think it's kind of naive to think that we could just do away with the current system as it is and just kind of replace it with a wholesale kind of new thing. Like, that's not realistic. And it's also not a practical way to go about the issue. So the better way to go about the issue would be to think about and really try to understand what leads people to do these things. And then you can point to these different things. Maybe it's economic conditions. Maybe it is some type of misrecognition of what, I'm just going through examples. And then we can tailor the solution to fit the issue. But if we just throw this kind of one size fits all solution, which it doesn't fit hardly anything, we just end up with this Byzantine system that locks up tons of people, but it doesn't actually change anything. So we have all these people locked up for these different issues, but the same issues are still happening. So why not try to opt for a system that tries to do both? We try to rehabilitate people while also trying to understand kind of the origins or the sources of these behaviors. And so I think what ends up happening is that I think a lot of people you kind of said this, when someone engages in like a heinous crime or an act that we just deem as being so immoral that we don't even think that they are then human enough to deserve any type of empathy. And I think that is also a problem. I think we should be able to be in a position to empathize with anybody, or maybe not empathize, but sympathize with anybody. And I think that's hard to do. I think the harder thing to do is to sympathize with people, especially if you think that they have committed or engaged in a behavior that is just so like morally wrong. And so I think that is the task for people who are both trying to make a better world while also trying to get at the underlying reasons that we need prisons in the first place. The easier task is to lock them up and throw away the key. The harder task is to say, why did this happen in the first place? And is there anything we can do to try to understand how it might not happen again?
I guess I envy that notion, empathy for someone that committed a violent crime. Do you believe in consequences?
Yes, but I don't necessarily think that consequences have to be harmful to someone. And like, for instance, if someone commits a violent murder, do I believe that they should have to suffer for inflicting harm on another person? I don't personally think that, because I don't know what it's accomplishing. I'm all about how do we make the world better. And I don't think that engaging in types of behaviors that essentially it's a tit for tat thing. And I don't believe tit for tat necessarily gets us anywhere closer to a world where we wouldn't need, I'm doing air quotes because I don't think we need prisons, but people might say need prisons in the first place. And so my question to anyone is like, why does there need to be suffering? If the suffering has already happened, why is inflicting that same suffering on the person, why is it necessary? Like, what is it achieving aside from giving you some type of, I don't know, psychological satisfaction? Like, what is the material reason for it?
I can imagine the comments just being lit right now as I'm listening. You're painting a beautiful utopia oasis right now that I just feel isn't possible. I mean, we can agree to disagree. I get that you see like the bigger picture in things. You're saying that people are looking at it myopically, more so with consequences, but you're looking at the bigger picture. Like, I don't think people are trying to prevent all violence. At this point, they want to know, how can we settle this issue now?
I never said that I was anti-consequences. I said that I think we should reimagine what we think consequences should be. My question is, why do consequences have to mean someone who committed that murder then having to be subjected to a life of essentially being treated as subhuman? That was my question. I didn't say that I don't think that something shouldn't happen. I am imploring people to reimagine what that something might be. And what I'm saying is that it doesn't necessarily have to be one that occupies kind of this tit for tat kind of space. It can be one that actually treats people as though they are human. And I know people might say, well, they didn't act like humans in that moment, so they need to be taught a lesson. My question is, well, what lesson is being taught by subjecting someone to the conditions of prison that they might be then subjected to if they commit that type of murder? And I never really ever get an answer to it. It's just kind of like, well, it's just wrong, and they need to be, treated accordingly. And I'm just kind of like, well, at this point, prison is just serving as a way to make people feel good about themselves for putting other people in this position, because it's not solving anything. There's no justice involved. There's no rehabilitation involved. It's not essentially changing the conditions so that something like this doesn't happen in the future. So what is it accomplishing aside from making people feel good in the moment? Our policy should not operate solely to make people feel good about themselves. That's not the point of policy. The point of policy is to think about ways in which we can create a society that is just, that works well for everyone to the extent that it can, and so on. And so I don't understand why throwing someone in solitary confinement or putting them in jail and locking away the key and making them sleep on the floor and making them eat slop for dinner and all these other things is going to do any of those things. It might make you feel good when you sleep at night knowing that, we stuck it to them, but I don't think it's addressing anything.
Right.
And like I said before, 10 more times than not, the types of people who are going to suffer most from this system are people who look like me and you. So I think that's something that should be kept in mind.
I just think that we've been conditioned, and it's hard to break conditioning. And I feel like we've been conditioned since the beginning of time, an eye for an eye.
My question to you would then be what do you derive from that?
I just feel like that person should feel the pain that they caused me. Maybe it is a morale thing. I want him to experience, empathize my feelings by suffering themselves. Ooh, that sounds terrible. But
how would this calculus change if you find out that the person is in prison and they don't feel as though they're suffering? What if they don't care? What if they don't feel anything?
I feel better that their freedoms are being taken away for whatever terrible thing that they did.
Ultimately, what I'm hearing is that your satisfaction derives from somebody else's pain, essentially. Nothing that you're getting. So it's a straight up shot in the front.
I feel like justice is being done. If that person is caught and can't do it anymore to anyone else, they are locked up and locked away. I'm not saying that, I want to off them myself, but at least I know that they can't do this to anyone else.
What makes you think they would want to do this to someone else, though?
Cyclical nature, repeat offenders.
But we know, I'll recommend this book because she talks about this. Most of the data show that most people who engage in these types of behavior are not people who have histories of engaging in violence and things. I think one thing that this book does a really good job of is really dispelling the myths that we have about prison and thinking about prison really in historical terms and thinking about the functions that prison play. And most of the times they don't exist to keep the world safe, obviously, because look at the world. They function to essentially control. And most of the times the people that are being controlled are people who are poor, people who are Black, people who are family of immigrant, and so on. And so I just think we need to be critical about who these systems are serving. Like I said with the Wall Street episode, you're not going to beat the master using the master's tools. It's just not going to happen. And so I think I get it. On one hand, it's really hard to be, and people will say, you just try to be the bigger person. I'm like, it's not about that. It's about thinking bigger picture and thinking about how these so-called systems of justice are not just, and they don't actually improve the world. In fact, I would argue that make the world worse. So that would be
you are of a different breed, sir. I've known him for way over a decade now. I've never seen you angry. Ever. Ever. Which is crazy to me. You're just a jolly person. And it is what it is. More people in the world should be like you.
I have a chain I bought the other day. It just says compassion. So I just try to be compassionate. Even to people I don't think necessarily deserve compassion in the most objective sense. I try to extend that to everyone. Because we just...
Look, I'm like Kaya, electric chair. Seriously. So we can move the conversation forward. Okay, we're going to agree to disagree.
So I would say that there is plenty of evidence that shows, and I think this is a mic drop point, that we have built more prisons and more people have been incarcerated, despite the fact that all of these violent crimes that allegedly or necessitate prisons in the first place have been trending down. So as violent crime has been trending down, prisons have been going up. And to me, that is evidence that obviously this is much more than just keeping people safe. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, moving on to our last topic of today's show is, I see what's going on in the Senate right now, but first and foremost, can you let me know what a filibuster is?
Yes. So the way that the filibuster works is, so if you look at Congress, I've talked about this before. So it's not usually just enough to get, so there's 100 people in the Senate. And so this is a conversation specifically for the Senate. Most of the legislation that's voted on actually requires 2/3 of the Senate to get passage, and not just a simple majority. So simple majority obviously would be 50 votes. And in this case, Kamala Harris would be the tiebreaker. But a simple 2/3 majority would require 60 votes in the Senate to pass a piece of legislation. And so the filibuster essentially is a technique that if the minority party, in this case Republicans, recognize that Democrats, the majority party, in this case Democrats, don't have those 60 votes, what ends up happening is that they can employ what's called a filibuster. So really what it is, it's a delaying tactic. So when you get to 60 votes, you get what's called cloture. And so cloture means that you could end debate and actually vote on the bill or whatever. But if you don't have the 60 votes, you can't achieve cloture. And the way that they stop you from getting there is by employing the filibuster. Historically, the filibuster has actually been employed for long periods of time, and actually like people actually standing on the floor of the Senate and just talking for like days and days. So I believe the longest filibuster, it may have gotten superseded, but at one point, the longest filibuster was actually when Southern Democrats and some Republicans were trying to stop the Civil Rights Act from being passed. So they literally got on the floor of the Senate for like months, and they coordinated this so that somebody could talk literally continuous so they could never get to the point of actually voting on the bill. So yeah, it's crazy. So the filibuster is essentially a way for the minority party to stymie the majority from passing a legislation. The notion that this is a way to create a better bill or to negotiate, I think is kind of Pollyannish, because we know from history that, in recent history anyway, that that's not really what it's been used for. It's really been a means to obstruct. And then from a political strategy, it's great if you're in the minority because you can block everything. And then when the midterms come up next year, what Mitch and all the rest of them will say is, well, look, the Democrats didn't do anything. They promised they were going to pass this, and that. They didn't do any of it. I'm like, yeah, because you filibustered everything. But they know that most people don't pay that close attention. So all the average person will see is, oh, Congress didn't pass anything. They said they were going to give me a $2,000 check. They didn't do that. They said they were going to do this reform. They didn't do that. So obviously they're not doing their job. Let's give the other side a chance.
But how come the Democrats can't just do what the Republicans are doing?
So Republicans, it's important to remember, their goal of legislating is just not to legislate at all. They are anti-government. So when they're in power, generally what they do, they essentially just don't do anything for the most part. If they do, they might pass a tax bill here and there. And when they do that, they'll usually use what's called budget reconciliation. So with budget reconciliation, you actually only need a simple majority. So in that case, you only need 50 votes plus one. The issue with budget reconciliation is that it narrows the scope of what you can actually pass. So usually you can't have these far-reaching kind of sweeping policies that are changed with budget reconciliation. Usually what you can do is you can tweak the tax code or give people tax rebates, or you kind of play with crunch the numbers a little bit, but it kind of is limited if you're trying to offer some type of sweeping reform, you can't do that unless you have, the 60 votes. So now the debate is, well, why don't Democrats just get rid of the filibuster altogether and they can just pass everything they want? Well, the issue is that we have two very centrist Democrats, Joe Manchin in West Virginia and Kristen Sinema in Arizona, who have publicly said that they are in favor of keeping the filibuster. The reason being is because they are from states that are, West Virginia is a red state now, and Arizona is
So
decided.
they're worried about saving their own asses over the
Exactly.
country.
They
I
are.
bet you they're white, right?
Yes, they are white. So one thing that Mitch was doing, because you know that in the Senate it's technically split, and so
Right.
I mean Kamala's the tiebreaker. But what Mitch McConnell was trying to do was essentially use the split to get all these concessions from Democrats and saying, oh, well, I'm not gonna, unless you can promise that you won't end the filibuster, like I'm not gonna go along with this, and that. And he finally caved in, and people were calling that a win for Democrats. And I'm kind of like, I don't know, because Mitch McConnell is always playing backgammon and they're always playing Candyland, they being the Democrats. So I don't know. Like, it's kind of hard to know, because the fact that he kind of gave in that easily, to me, signifies that he's playing the long game. I just know what that long game is. So I would never underestimate him, because he is.
It seems like we just need to put banana peels wherever he's walking or something. I'll put something in his food, something.
Can we say it on YouTube?
And with that, y'all, that was our episode. It was a little long, but, I'm pretty sure y'all learned something. Please do not attack me or Jared.
Please.
We are not trying to tell you how to think. We are just trying to provoke thought, okay? Thank you. Now, again, where can they follow you if they want to, get a book recommendation? I will put that in the description.
Yes, I can be found at JAYC Tiger Fan. That's both at Twitter and Instagram.
Great. Yeah, so make sure y'all like, comment, subscribe, and share. Please share this with your friends, because, we be speaking some truth here, and I think everyone should know about politics and what's going on. Anywho, with that, we will see you next week for the bullshit. All right. Bye.